Right. Hi everyone. We'll make a start. So we'll just a quick one. Say we'll take questions as we go. If you've got a question, but just please make sure that you use the microphone. There's a roaming mic, so make sure you're talking to that. So a bit of a motley crew here for you today to talk about our sort of farm to fork story that we've got at Whitley Manor. So Harry's going to start and sort of introduce the farm and where he's got to today, and then we'll sort of take you through where we're trying to head.
Lovely stuff. Thanks, Ed. Hi, everyone. My name's Harry. I farm at Whitley Manor, which is in Newport, Shropshire. Our farm to fork story really has developed over the last 18 months, and that's really come about through just a huge amount of change within our business. Historically, the farm was a mixed conventional farm of 200 hectares, with probably the first change really starting in 2018, which is when we started to go down the regenerative agroecological route. And within the last couple of years, we are also the Hutchinson's Helix Agroecology site in the country as well. So today, we're 200 hectares, and we do another 400 hectares of contracting. And livestock has always been a very, very key part on the farm. We've had indoor pigs for 35 years with a 550 sow herd, finishing 15,000 finishes per year. And the change really came about in start of 2022 when we decided to leave the indoor pig sector. And really that was because just of a huge lack of control. As independent pig producers, we just had such a huge lack of control, and we were just taking on so much risk with what we were doing within our operation. As many of you know, the pig sector is a high output, low margin industry, and there's a very, very significant cyclical prosperity pattern, sort of as the price goes up and down and people come in and out of the industry. And there's a huge reliance on the stability of the cereal price, obviously the main ingredient into that industry with cereals, wheat and barley. So that's very, very important. And in 2022 or 2021, it was almost the perfect storm of everything going wrong. In China in 2018, 2019, there was a huge disease, African swine fever. So in China, if they've got 40% of the pigs globally, half of those pigs died. So a fifth of the pigs in the world died. And from 2018, 2019, what actually happened was the rest of the world came up to meet that demand. And then as 2021, 2022 clocked round, the Chinese had bounced back, and all of a sudden the world was in a fairly big oversupply situation. So that was happening. Brexit was happening. So there was some trading difficulties with the EU, which was our biggest trading partner. COVID happened, massively had huge impacts on the supply chain, both from a hospitality perspective, but also just generally working in abattoirs. Abattoirs were running at a very, very small percentage of what they normally do. And that obviously had a huge impact with backing up of pigs on farm, which had devastating effects, really. At that time, there was a high input price of cereals and a relatively low price of pork. So when I talk about volatility, back then we were sort of at £1.38 a kilo. Now we're at £2.18. So even in 18 months, we've changed by sort of 60-odd%, which is a similar swing to what we've seen with the price of wheat. And as a business, we were also at that. We'd been on the farm producing pigs for 35 years, and we were just at that crossroads of where buildings were starting to get tired and really needing to go in another direction. We'd got a pretty good handle on costs, but nothing really prepares you for working really hard. So at that time, we were producing 1,000 grower pigs every 3 weeks, so 40-kilo pigs. But nothing ever really prepares you for putting 6 months of effort in to produce a product that has a nil value. That's really where it got to, and it was absolutely devastating. No one wanted to buy the pigs because the cereal price was so high that the actual economics of doing the job didn't stack up. The supply chain was completely knackered because of what was going on with COVID, and that's really where we were. It was absolutely soul-destroying. And I suppose, really, as a farm, as all farmers are, and there's so many here today, we've all got used to dealing with these risks involved with producing food. And I suppose the learning that I've gone through by going through that process is that going forward, I want to do whatever I can to distance myself from that risk that we've taken previously. We were very lucky. We had the arable business to kind of prop us up when we came out of indoor pigs. And we were very, very lucky at that time as well that we had, a growing contracting area that we could also fall back onto. So it gave me a bit of time, a bit of headspace, and it also just gave me a little bit of thought that we needed to go in a completely different direction. We needed a fresh approach going forward. And that fresh approach, as it's talked about in places like today, was really just to focus on quality and producing a quality product. It sounds crazy, but producing 15,000 pigs a year, not for one single second did we think about quality. It was growth rates, feed conversion, mortality, all of those things that drive efficiency and drive you to stay in the game, especially when the job's at its worst. But we never thought about it. So on the recognition that farmers are normally better at producing food than marketing it, we were also we were incredibly lucky sort of 12 or 18 months ago to meet Brett, who's going to talk in a second. So Brett's a Michelin star chef in London. He runs the Ledbury in Notting Hill and the Harwood Arms in Fulham. And we got talking and we very quickly realised that we had a very similar ideology in terms of how we wanted to farm and what we thought about how food should be produced. So that's really the background of the farm. So what we're going to do now is sort of just go through the journey that we've gone on in the last 18 months from different perspectives, both from an agronomy perspective, and then go all the way through and talk about how it ends up on the plate. There's also going to be some pork flying around, so you definitely came to, so definitely stay put, don't stand up and go anywhere else. So there'll be some charcuterie flying around in a minute for you to taste. So with that in mind, I'm going to pass you on to Ian Robertson, who's going to talk about our journey from a soil health perspective, because that's been really, really fundamental to what we're doing, especially with the pigs as well. And he will take it from here.
Great, thanks, Harry. My name's Ian Robertson, and I'm General Manager for Sustainable Soil Management, which really gets involved with people like Harry, or all farmers really, enabling them to understand why and how their soil is performing like it does, and then make sure that anything we're doing to it is enhancing it, so through biological, physical, or any chemical actions we need to take. The first thing we did down at Harry's was to do what we call soil baselining. So we look at the soil in a lot more detail, and we spent a lot of time looking at the chemistry of it that then alludes to the physics and the biology. And the screenshot that's up at the moment is much talked about, physics, chemistry and biology, to the point that it's in every magazine. And I think modern agriculture, certainly in the UK, we're finding that everyone focuses on the physical side because it's easy. You have a green field, you plough it, it goes brown. And also then you go to the chemical side, which is you've got a green field, you use glyphosate, it goes brown. But there was very little credence paid to the biology of what was going on. So when we started working with Harry, we looked at the physical side, we did some chemical testing, and we were basically not educating Harry because Harry knew a lot about it already, but it was trying to make sure that anything you do physically or chemically will affect your biology. And we are all biological farmers because we're all growing a crop, livestock or whatever. But a lot of people have forgotten about that fact. So we focused on those areas, made some detailed soil testing, and the part that everyone gets bored with, I think, is the chemistry, because everyone thinks it's really difficult. But the more we understand about soil chemistry, the more we understand about the soil physics and then about the soil biology. And we were very quick, or not so quick, to look at focusing on the chemistry, but not lose the biology. And there were quite a lot of people talking to us at the time saying, well, don't worry about it, just go and look at biology. And we're like, no, we're not ready for that yet. So, as I said, we spent a lot of time doing the chemical soil testing, and that highlighted, if you change the slide, Ed, hopefully, that some of the key things that we were needing to measure, Harry had always been measuring pH in the field, which is the water pH. We then started looking at the buffer pH, which was the resting pH of the soil. That then makes us labels us to understand whether you've got a bacterial or fungal dominated soil. So again, rather than just saying we want to change all our soils to be fungal dominant, the buffer pH of the soil wouldn't allow us to do that. So we had to make amendments to that to allow us to go down that route. We also measured the cation exchange capacity, which really simplistically is how big is your soil, how many nutrients will it hold. or can it hold? Is it a leaky soil? Will it have a great big reserve on there? And I'll explain a bit more about Harry's actual soil in a minute. And then we're also looking at, it's a bulk density and texture, so sand, silt, clay fraction, and how heavy is the soil. And that really alludes to how well the soil will structure. So again, on the high sandy soil, we're finding that we've got a soil that's much more like a brownie rather than a nice chocolate cake. And at that point, we're going, well, actually, what do we do to try and make it more chocolate cake-like, more porosity? And that a lot of people were doing that by doing cultivations, but what we're finding, every time you cultivate it up, and then it goes down tight again. So we're going to cake, brownie really quickly. So we're looking at doing things to stabilize that much more. And part of that is about the extractable nutrients that we find. So a different way of measuring again. And we convert everything we do into kilos per hectare. Because ultimately, everyone in this room is probably yielding in kilos per hectare. You may be applying nutrients in kilos per hectare or actives, biologicals in grams per hectare. I'm not very clever and I don't understand milligrams per litre. So we convert it to make it really easy to understand what we're trying to do. And then we measure the pool, which we call the total elements, which is like the deep freeze, which I think is the next one. And what we're trying to do is get away from the moron principle, that if we haven't got enough of an element in a soil, what we tend to do is ring up a supplier and say, please, can I have more of that element? Most soils that we're measuring have got a massive deep freeze, and that deep freeze is full of nutrition that's complex with calcium, iron, any number of things. But if I have a chest freezer at home, and if you ask me what's in it, I do not know. Most people don't know what's in their freezer. So by measuring the freezer, we can look at it and say, well, what have you got in there? What form is it in? And what can we do with management practices to make that food in your freezer more available to your plants? And that's when we start a much more holistic journey covering rotations, cultivations, different plant species, biology, chemical amendments, etc., to make sure that what we've got we're using to the best degree we can. And to put some numbers to it, if you jump back one, Ed, to make it numbers again, kilos per hectare, the soil there had something like 1,200 kilos of total frozen, call it phosphate, with a very small amount available. So the normal practice would be to let's go and put more phosphate out of a bag onto this soil. Actually, what we're doing at Harry's within the rotation is we're doing things to mobilize that phosphate out of the complex, out of the deep freeze, and move over to the right to be more readily available. And some of the things we were looking at from the chemistry then comes to the physics and the biology, and we're doing very simple things like VES, visual soil assessments, water infiltration tests. So when we started with Harry, we're finding that the visual soil assessment was very, very browny, not chocolate cake. Water infiltration was poor, leading to surface runoff and diffuse pollution issues. We're looking at worm counts, very simple measure of biology. They weren't brilliant at the start. And then we're using more lab work, which is the PLFA from Eurofins, the phospholipid fatty acid microbial test, to give us an idea of bacteria, fungi, and the protozoa levels. And then we did a bit with the microbiometer card to give us an instant reading of bacteria and fungi. So really useful tools to then enable us to make the right decisions or make sure that what we're doing is having the right effect on the farm. What the baselining at Harry highlighted was, first thing, we've got very high sand content. And that sand content was making really poor water retention, and or when we're getting a lot of water, we're getting soil slumping and a lot of surface runoff and diffuse pollution. So one of the key things there is that Harry also wanted to do some no-tilling straight away, and we didn't do that. We did a gentle, we stopped excessive cultivations, but we didn't stop altogether. And then when we made sure that every time the soil could, we grew a crop in it, putting more roots in there, more carbon into the soil to make it more water resilient. We also found that it had a very high amount of magnesium to calcium. That affects the soil structure at a very small micro level. And you were finding that soils, we call them the 2-day soils. 2 days it was too dry, and then 2 days' time it suddenly got very wet. And that's the effect of magnesium on the humus and clay colloids. So what we addressed that by using small amounts of gypsum, calcium sulfate, and again we saw the brownie effect go back up to a chocolate cake effect. We also had a very high level of potassium, which was years of slurry. And again, potassium's an awful thing in the respect of what it does to soil structure. It collapses your soil and stacks it. So again, we're having soil structural issues because of the chemistry and the high potassium. So what we started to do there was reduce the amount of slurry we're using and then make sure that we were only applying potassium to what the crop requirement was, rather than using lots of slurry and overcooking our potassium level. The soil also had a massive amount of phosphate, as I showed earlier. So we significantly reduced any phosphate applications. And what we were doing, if we were doing any at all, we're placing it in the rhizosphere. And then we're using things like organic acids and biology with cover crops to cycle that phosphate rather than keep applying more of it. We found that we had very, very high active carbon, which is a potassium permanganate test, which was highlighting that a lot of the organic matter that Harry had been putting in was turning around too quickly. So it was a bit like a log burner. It was on fire, so we could never really build that organic matter, which again was causing the soil to collapse. So what we've done there is we're reducing our nitrogen and slurry applications. It sounds a bit silly, but we're actually increasing the organic matter content of the soil by not mobilizing and burning so much. And then again at the start, we found the worm counts were very poor. And again, since we've changed all that system, using less tillage, less slurry, and more what we call biological foods, so cover crops, organic acids, molasses, etc., we're seeing an improvement in worm counts, which is fairly obvious because we're seeing an improvement in soil structure. So the whole system is starting to work. By doing less, we're seeing improvements. And then the next. Do you want to cover that bit?
Sure, let's do that. Thank you, Ian. Yeah, so just quickly, who the hell am I? So Ed Brown, agronomist and head of agroecology for Hutchinson's, and I've worked with Harry since 2018 to sort of help him introduce and implement the sort of regenerative system he's trying to work towards. So what Ian's just done is obviously explained the process that we go through at the start of anybody who wants to sort of make this transition. And actually, even if they don't, having an in-depth understanding of your soil, how it works, what it would respond to well and not, is absolutely critical if any farming system is going to be successful. And Harry's was no different. So that's why we put the time and the effort into getting that level of understanding of his soil and how it works and what we need to put in place. So I'm just going to quickly whiz through what we're actually doing and what that looks like in terms of implementing the system, and then I'll hand over to Brett to talk about the finished product. So Ian's mentioned, some of the chemistry element, and we did have an issue with high magnesium levels. And for any of you who farm sandy soils, they are just as challenging as clay soils, I can assure you. And when you've got high mag sands, you've basically got concrete. It can be hard work. So we're using gypsum strategically to just help us with that, trying to rebalance those calcium-magnesium ratios. But definitely we weren't in a position straight away, and still aren't, to go complete no-till, because initially, until we get that system in place and build the soil structure that we want, we do occasionally need to go through and loosen soil. So we're using a low disturbance Grange toolbar where we need to, not where we don't, just to go and make sure that we're creating that structure where the soil hasn't managed to do it itself yet. We're also still using the plough, and I'll touch on why in a second. But we said, well, if we're going to have to plough, then at least try and do it as best we can. So we've shallowed it right up. So we're only ploughing at 6 inches. So if we're going to have to do it, let's at least only just turn that nice bit of topsoil over rather than going at 12 inches and causing carnage. Cover crops, I would say, are critical in any system and on any soil type, but particularly so at Harry's. Sands are not very good at structuring themselves, so they need a root in them at all times. So wherever we can, we're keeping a root in the ground. So cover crops, catch crops, companion crops, to constantly keep that root in there, and that's going to be the way that we can eventually get to, hopefully, to a complete no-till system. And then, of course, the picture at the bottom right is what can happen when we've sort of got that scenario we're aiming for. So when we're happy with soil structure, soils are in a position where they're suited to direct drilling. We've got the capability to do that, and certainly on sandy soils where we're trying to retain moisture rather than get rid of it, we can keep covers living right until the last minute and drill straight into them. I'm not going to go through all the principles of Regen Ag and what we're trying to do, because you'll have heard that to the nth degree over the last 2 days. But I'm going to focus on a few things, particularly around diversity, because I think it's my favourite of the principles because it's fun, but it's also really, really important to get diversity back in the system where we can. So Harry is using parts of habitat on the farm, so pollinator mixes, flower mixes, to try and bring back some beneficial insects, pollinators back onto the farm, which is all helping us to reduce our pesticide inputs. We're also looking at intercropping, so we're sort of well versed with beans and oats now, and we're happy that that works, and it's delivering a higher output for less cost, so it's a bit of a no-brainer. We're now looking at peas and barley, because actually peas and barley suits really well to go into the pigs. And again, it's a really nice way of increasing your output off the same acreage, and it's helping us reduce inputs, because those crops just have a really nice synergy. They're healthier, they need less fungicide sprays, or they need none. So that's all good. And then even when we're growing a single crop in a field, we're trying to bring diversity in there. So the picture at the top left is a wheat blend. So we're completely on wheat blends now. All of the wheat we grow is a 4-way blend, and I think we're on year 3 now. Again, we're happy it works. We're matching, if not increasing, average yields, and we're doing it for less cost. So that's a bit of a no-brainer. And then lastly, looking at nitrogen quite carefully. So trying to pull back how much we use, but when we do use it, try and be a bit cleverer about it and doing it in a way that has less impact on the soil, so that we can then produce healthier crops, which then end up in our pigs. So we're adding carbon sources to all of our liquid fertilizer, and we're also applying foliar nitrogen to all of our crops, following this man in the front row's guidance very carefully. So that's kind of how it looks by way of implementing it. And so we can't escape the fact that we've got a fairly serious problem with resistant ryegrass at Harry's. It's sort of crept up on him a bit over the years, and probably, Harry would admit that we didn't nip it in the bud, or he didn't nip it in the bud soon enough. So that has got to the point now where it's having some fairly serious implications on what we can and can't do with cropping on the farm. And if any of you in the room have got blackgrass or got blackgrass issues, I can assure you this stuff makes it look like a fluffy bunny. It is horrific. It's yield robbing. It will grow any time of the year, anywhere, and it's made life a real challenge. But alongside that, we got to a point where it was making farming the way we wanted to farm so hard that we had to just have a bit of a sit down and a rethink about how we did things. And funnily enough, that coincided with the pig issues. So we've just completely flipped on our head how we think about dealing with ryegrass and trying to farm our way out of it with something out of a can, or even the cultural methods that work with blackgrass just don't work with ryegrass. So we had to flip the system on its head, and the pigs have been a great asset in order to do that. We're also growing sunflowers, which Harry's just started pressing the oil. Sunflowers are great because they have a really, really good suppression effect on ryegrass, but you can also drill them much later in the spring, so you get that spring flush of ryegrass out the way, and then you can put the sunflowers in. And we've now got the pigs out on grass, and I must admit, driving up that farm driveway, having done so since 2018, it is a real pleasure to drive up there now, because you see pigs out in pasture and in woods, and it looks so right. There's something so right about it, and of course that's what we want the end product to look like. So at that point, I'll go to the next slide and hand over to Harry and Brett to talk about that new pig enterprise.
So back to pigs. So firstly, just talking about ryegrass for a second, that's almost a classic case that when I came back into the family farming business, the pig business was such a big part of it that all I focused on was the pigs, and almost the arable was a bit of a byproduct, and that's probably why it did creep up on us, really. But the pigs as they stand today are a traditional Iberian Spanish pig on the breeding side, and as I said earlier, sort of eating quality kind of sits at the centre of what we're trying to do, the production model, and we're now sort of driving and looking at how we get the best out of that. So we're driving towards forage and pasture feeding, and getting these pigs outside for as much as possible. It's amazing having done it for years and seeing pigs inside that you kind of, because that's the way you do it, you just continue to do it that way. And then something like this happens, and all of a sudden, seeing them outside, as Ed says, feels so right. You know, so you're seeing them in their right habitat and having a great time. So over the last 12 months, Brett will talk in a second, but Brett had got pigs in a few places. We've sort of consolidated those onto the farm now, and we've got a breeding herd of about 100 breeding females, and we're just going to grow that on and see where it goes, really. It's really, really important, you know, from Brett and I's perspective, that we challenge each other going forward. You know, we're trying to do something that's different. We're learning as we go, and it's really important that, you know, we maximise our animal welfare. That's so key with what we're doing, and also the soil health. So those two things have got to work together perfectly. But there's also a continual recognition from my part of making sure that we look at what happened on the old business, the unsustainable business, and make sure that we take lessons. We take lessons from that. So we weren't before, you know, when it was big, we weren't self-sufficient in feed. We weren't self-sufficient in terms of how much land we needed to spread our manure on. And because of that model, we were encouraged to get bigger and bigger and drive down our cost of production to improve our economies of scale, just to survive in business when the job wasn't very good. And that's not what we're doing now at all, but it's on the forefront of my mind all the time. It's really important, Ed said the word synergy earlier, it's really important that we maximise the synergy between the land and the livestock. So we talk about self-sufficiency in feed, so that's really important now. So we're producing all of our feed that's going into our own pigs, so we've got full traceability on what's going into into that product. And that's also for energy, but also for protein. So Brett and I really believe that we don't want to be feeding soy. I'm sure Brett will probably talk about that in a minute. So peas, beans lead the way there in terms of protein going into the rations. We're grazing cover crops. And we are feeding the pigs on silage, and we're really pushing, certainly from my very commercial background in pigs, the envelope of what we can do with a pig. And as we talked about with ryegrass, we've got a weed burden issue on the farm. How can we best use those pigs to try and solve that problem? Whether it's rotating ground, but just certainly using the pigs for sometimes what they're really good at, which is just cleaning up ground. Ed mentioned earlier about starting up newer enterprises to kind of complement what we're doing on the pigs. So later this year, we're sort of starting to crush oilseed rape and sunflowers, and then sort of sell that alongside our pork, as well as really, really importantly, having another input into producing our own feed. And whether that's from rape meal or whether that's for an energy source from the oil, that's a really, really important part of that too. From a regenerative perspective, obviously we continue to march forward with the endeavours of reducing chemical inputs, fungicides, insecticides. We continue to pull back our fertiliser, less fuel, less horsepower, and that's, yeah, as ever, continue to try and step away from those things or reduce them as much as possible. And really, it's just for us, having gone through what we've gone through, building a sustainable business going forward. You know, when you think about it, farmers, you know, I said earlier about farmers being exposed to risk. You know, from an arable perspective, we're typically buying inputs 10 months, typically up to 10 months in advance of kind of needing them before we've even got it in the shed. We then trade those products on a very volatile market whilst being exposed to ever volatile weather. So we are as farmers very, very exposed to risk all the way through, really. But when I come back to looking at our own business, we've got to make sure that we have healthy plants, and that's where the regenerative side of what we're doing and the agroecology side of it comes through. So those healthy plants are grown from healthy soils to produce healthy, high-quality pork. And then ultimately that, what I'm hoping, will give us a stronger business resilience in the future. So that's definitely enough from me. I hope, yeah, got some porks flying around, and Brett can talk about it from his side.
Great. Thanks, Harry. So my name's Brett Graham. I'm a chef. I run a restaurant in London called the Ledbury, also a pub in Fulham called the Harwood Arms. In 2017, a friend of mine owns this fabulous house in Oxford called Ainhoe Park, and he asked me to build a deer park, and I thought it might be an interesting idea in time. But a couple of years later, ended up building the deer park, put a herd of deer in there, collected some breeding stock from around the country, and started off, and we produced, like you probably think, oh, chef, producing his own food, produced 12 carcasses. Very proud of that. In the restaurant, obviously. Then the next year we did 120, 300, 500, and last year we did 1,500 carcasses. And we do that by bringing people into the system in which we believe is the right way to produce them. So produced under a park situation, so as less inputs as possible. Don't use any wormers, don't use any chemical fertilizer, nothing. We just manage the grass, and the best way in a deer park to manage the grass is with a rifle, and pray for some rain, obviously, at the right times of year as well. So we produce a great product, used in all the best restaurants around the country, not just for us, it's for everybody. We supply companies from Google to some of the big banks in Canary Wharf to 3-star restaurants in London, and lots of places in between. When lockdown started, being a chef and working now as I've worked in my career, I spent 2 days in front of the television, and my wife said to me, "Are you okay?" And I wasn't sure if I was okay, because it was a strange time for us, because life as we knew it as cooks and people looking after people in hospitality just stopped. And I was very keen to explore the farming side, in which I just become involved, and I just got 15 beehives in Ainhoe, so I was trying really hard to do lots of various different things. And I found a mate of mine who'd done some genetic work for me in a Spanish guy, a vet, with the deer, and I asked him, I told him that I needed some Iberian pigs. And when he said to me, "Do you want them dead or alive?" and I said alive, my wife nearly fell over, because living in London and ordering pigs on the telephone, she wasn't quite sure where they were going to live. Neither was I. But nevertheless, I ordered them, only because this Spanish guy was amazing, went around, and I'd known him for some years. We got a little collection, a sort of, I'd probably say it was a secondary class breeding group of sows and a boar that I brought over from Spain live. When they arrived, I saw them all come off the same compartment in the trailer at the end, and I called the Spanish guy and said, I asked them to be separated in certain various areas. When they stop at their resting point, they mixed them back in, and he said, "We'll have plenty of babies." So I think we had about 150 born in the first farrowing, which presented a big problem, because I didn't have anywhere for them to live long term. But I met this amazing lady called Wendy Scudamore in Pontrilas, in Hereford, and she was doing the isolation for me. Fell in love with them, amazing. We started working on them, working out a breeding program to get 2 separate breeding lines going. And because as a chef, I had always admired Iberian pigs from afar for not only the amazing quality of their fresh meat, which I'd been using in the restaurant, and which just about most other top restaurants in the country would use Iberian pork, is so far above and beyond anything we've got probably here as a traditional breed, in my opinion. And you can look at it in the same way as cows. People might be critical of people importing a breed that's not a traditional breed, and obviously I did get some flack for that, but in the same way we're walking around here looking at continental breeds of cows or Wagyu beef that obviously isn't a traditional breed from this country, we have to look at progress as well. And I was also looking at how can we get pork, which is so undervalued and so badly treated, how can we get it to have the same respect as both the very best Herdwick lamb or the very best belted Galloway beef? Because pork has never traditionally been treated like that. So as we started breeding along and going along, we had, some ups and lots of downs of trying to get it right. And I had them spread over a couple of farms. I had them spread over 3 farms, in fact, just people who would take 50 at a time for me and try and juggle it around like that. Then I met Harry, went to the farm, worked out what we were going to do long term, tried to work out a system of how we could breed these pigs that sort of thought about the past, thought about the future, but also I was very keen to make sure that we weren't doing this as a hobby farming project. For a chef to be involved in meat production, there are lots of chefs involved in meat production probably, but they have 2 sows in their backyard and living in a pile of mud, and that's not a sustainable project that I sort of wanted to be involved in. Think about how commercially can we feed people. So we're now I think we're already at a good level. We're now at a point where most weeks we're selling 10 to 12 pigs at 165 kilo live weight. so about 125 kilo on the rail. We are supplying some of the best restaurants in the country. You'll see from some of these pictures, some of them are my restaurant and some of them other people's restaurants. We make charcuterie from the pork as well. And a lot of places making charcuterie in Britain have taken that thing like, oh, just use the old sows from maybe factory farmed animal, fed on a high soy protein diet, and the meat's not the same, very wet, doesn't quite work the same way in the way in which continental ham in places like Spain and Italy works so well. We've never fed any soy since I started. Trying to get a feed mill to make a no soy ration was a challenge. I think in the early days, before I knew many farmers, I think I phoned 28 feed merchants and found someone right at the other end of Yorkshire that would truck it down for me at some extortionate cost. But nevertheless, we did it. We now, as Harry explained, mill on farm. So that was always the first thing, was no soy. The other thing everyone asked me was, like, oh, they have to eat acorns like a Spanish pig can only live on acorns. But the things that have high omega-3s are things like avocados and olives, rapeseed as well, and sunflowers. Hence the reason we are growing sunflowers and growing rapeseed, which we now use in the restaurants. And the resulting meal from that that's high in those, cold pressed of course, are high in those omega-3s, go into the diet of the pigs. So a company called Rare and Pasture do all the curing for us down in Devon. And I would say where we're sort of going with the direction of the selling is on the fresh side of the meat. If you can see that picture, I think it's probably your bottom left, you'll see the marbling in the pork. Now, this is not a new thing, but it's something that very little people do in commercial aspect, is we're scanning those pigs, and the latest breeding stock I bought have all been scanned for intramuscular fat while they're alive. They get a score. They're incredibly valuable, the ones with the highest score. But what it means is that marbling becomes, as much as a feed perspective, becomes a genetic capability. So when we grow these pigs, if we're looking to the future to be competitive, to take on a lot of commercial growers, is can we get that pig to marble at a certain age? And traditionally, like you'll think with things like Wagyu beef, normally it's a combination of genetics and age. And if we can bring that age down, we can become more competitive. So a lot of our boars, all our boars now that we use for breeding have got a score for the intramuscular fat. And you'll see by that picture, that was about an 8-month-old, 50% Duroc, 50% Iberian. So that's what we're really focused on at this point. Lots of the production of the oils that we do with the rapeseed without glyphosates is, again, not a new thing, but we're making sure that those practices, all the way from the start of Harry's side, on the arable side, is making sure that those ingredients don't end up in our feed of our animals. And, you know, I think that what the animals put in their mouths are as important as what we eat as well. And a couple of years ago, I asked a farmer who produces for a very well-known butcher to send me a picture of the feed thing. And obviously, being a chef, I only understood about a quarter of it. But one of the ingredients in there was rapeseed meal preserved with formaldehyde. And so I did a bit of reading about it and thought, fucking hell, isn't that what Damien Hirst puts a shark in? You know, to stop it from going off. And I couldn't believe it. And I said to the butcher, do you know your farmer's producing like this? And, no, this is one of our best farmers. The farmer didn't even know, so it's not his fault. He was just buying a ration from somebody who was supplying it. And coming from a non-farming background, I find, Harry probably touched on a bit before, is when I go on farm with Harry, I'll have 10 really stupid ideas, and I'll see Harry look at the stockman and they'll have a little giggle. But there's sometimes one gem in there. And what's been really nice is that we're challenging each other all the time, even about how we cut grass. You know, if we're cutting grass in a field for the pigs, even just last week, I was like, why don't we just cut one strip every 5 meters? Then our bees will have flowers still, and then we'll reverse it 6 weeks later. And then the pigs will have something to eat. And we just why haven't we done that before? And I don't know, but that's the way we're going to start cutting grass now, is not cut all of it at once. So we don't want to turn it into a desert for the animals and then wait for the regrowth to happen and leave bare soil for the weather to dry out. We want to try and think about low-touch ways in which we can do it. And that's what I find really exciting with agriculture, is people are coming into the fold a bit more who are from backgrounds who are not told to drill whatever they're drilling on the 17th of April every year. It doesn't matter what the weather is. We're thinking about different ways of doing things. And that's where we're finding lots of gains with the pig project is we're getting this marbling to work. Sometimes it hasn't worked as well as I wanted to, and we've changed things that haven't worked and put us back. And what I think is really incredibly powerful on my side as a chef is that I'm trying to get the end product right, and Harry knows how to get there, but he's also incredibly good on software, incredibly good on making sure that the next thing after soy that we're talking about now is the feed conversion rate, to make sure that some of these traditional breeds that could come up with criticism of having a feed conversion rate of 6-1, and that's not good enough. And we need to think about ways in which we can produce food with less reliance on just pure grain. And then the next sort of thing we're working on in the next couple of months is trying to produce like a forage pellet to ultimately try and mix some grain into it, including the rapeseed and the sunflower meal, to feed it back to the pigs, to reduce that reliance on just a huge amount of feed going into the pigs. And one thing that struck me as a non-pig farmer was when I go into there, the pigs would be incredibly hungry. When you fed them, and if anyone's ever fed 100 pigs at the same time, it is a melee of like noise. You probably want your ear defenders on. And they all rush for the pen, and it seems to me that it's a really stressful time for the pigs because they seem like they're so anxious when the food comes or the door opens, they start getting anxious. And we're trying to think about ways, how do you not make pigs feel anxious at feeding time? So what we're exploring more is how can we fill out that ration with bran in the same way we would maybe put that on our breakfast cereal, so like a filler, and make a pellet that is filled up with grass. So we would still feed the same ration at 2.5 kilos a day, but we would maybe extend that to 5 kilos to include 2 kilos of haylage that's been hammer milled and then put into a pellet press. We've still got a lot of work to do on that and get the feeders right and make sure it all works, but basically give them an ad lib diet when they don't need one, but filled out with forage grown on the farm. And one of the cover crops that we had planted, that Harry had planted, well, I think it was a couple of weeks ago or something, I said, well, let's just make silage out of it and we'll feed that back to the pigs, but we're going to try and work on the pellet. I think we made 360 bales, and that's a lot of food. And so we're trying to work out ways in which that can go into their diet, where they're on a full ad lib diet. And now when they're on this ad lib diet, everything changes. There's no noise, they're peaceful, they don't feel anxious, they don't start running at the trough, less trips to, if you just fill up a big feeder for 3 or 4 days, less trips on the tractor, less compaction on the ground around the feeders. And they're the things we're trying to work on, and how we can keep them outside as long as possible. And we've had some fantastic results. We've still got a long way to go. We're trying to get to first base. We're getting to first base. Still got a long way and a long journey, and all these guys are important in that story. But from a chef's point of view, what I think two really great things that have come out of this is we don't need to import so much food if we start believing in some of the great things we've got here as well. And part of my farming business is going to Jersey cows as well, for finishing for meat, which has produced fantastic results. But how we can produce food and coming up at the restaurant every night is, and this pork is on the menu tonight, we're feeding 250 people a week, probably just on our pork, on our fresh pork, and at the start of the meal they have some cured, and at the main course at the moment they're having some of it roasted. But one of the things I thought was really powerful was I turned up to Harry's one night before we were doing a day on farm, and I bought him a jug of the rapeseed oil, some of the charcuterie, and some fresh pork and some fresh beef. And it was amazing to see a farmer who hadn't actually eaten his own food. And I was gobsmacked by how someone who produces food doesn't eat it as a chef. Because, the food I produce or work with, and I'd seeded with the venison, I get a huge amount of pride that I'm working with some incredible estates around the country, and linked up with some great farmers. And I see the results every night. I get to taste it and see it and test it and make sure it works and see the satisfaction from the customers. But seeing farmers that have never tasted the food that they produce, wild in my head. But it was really a wonderful moment to see how people and farmers now connect more via the work that I do, I work with lots of other people, how I can sort of get that ingredient back on their table. So we've still got a long way to go, but that's our story so far.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Brett. So yeah, that's it from us. I think we'll take questions. So yeah, if there are any questions, just fire your hand up and we'll bring the mic over. There's one here.
Thanks. 2 questions. First one, quick. Just about the pig feed. Are you doing anything to the beans and peas? Like, are you having to roast them or sprout them in any way, or just feed them fresh? And my second question is to you, Brett. In the farming world, we're seeing this huge rise in popularity about regenerative farming, and this event has grown massively over the last 5 years. In the chef world, are you seeing a similar trend with chefs becoming more in tune with how we're growing food? Are there events where you all collaborate?
I'll answer the first question really quickly. So in terms of peas, beans, obviously all grown ourselves, but from an actual productions perspective, nothing special at all. Everything goes through a hammer mill, or most things go through a hammer mill. But what we are trying to do on the production side is just try and lift the economics of growing them a bit. You never get that excited about the economics of growing legumes, but if we can grow them alongside, as I said, barley or other things to which actually in turn then lower the inputs, that's where it gets a bit more exciting from a growing perspective. But no, from a feed ingredient perspective, just through a hammer mill straight into a meal. Okay.
Yeah, it's interesting about chefs is probably like any industry really. I asked a couple of chefs the other day, a group of chefs I was with, some of them who work in some of the best restaurants in the country. We all happened to be together somewhere. I just asked a question. I said, how many eggs does a chicken lay a day? And they're like, yeah, because it's an ingredient we use every day, right? We use boxes of them. Every kitchen has 2 boxes of eggs. One of them said, I don't know, 12? I said, what do you think? It's like Heathrow flight pattern with 72 eggs just lined up in there firing out the back end sort of thing. And that answer, obviously, is not an uncommon answer for a chef to give. And it does show you sometimes how little chefs know about the ingredients they cook with, in the same way that farmers may for other parts of their business. It is growing probably. There's lots of subjects in our trade that we need to address. One of the ones that we touched on about the vegetable oil that we were making with the sunflowers and also rape is that while I was in my pub one day working out a no soy feeding project for the pigs and how it might work and have a meeting with it, I didn't know, but the vegetable oil upstairs is soy oil being poured in our deep fryer, and we're using 100 kilos a week. And so I just didn't know. It just said veg oil. I didn't know. I had to do some digging, some research. It was only 6 months ago I found out that my whole career, vegetable oil was soy oil from probably deforested area in Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina. And I just didn't know because the information wasn't there. I have to dig for it. So I think it is growing, and I think chefs are getting more sort of concerned about what happens. The big thing I had to push on the last couple of years was we were selling venison, and all the chefs, especially in the fancy restaurants, were like, oh, we just want the saddle, we just want the saddle. And I was like, you can't have the saddle, you can't just have the saddle. And I took a few guys on a day from a variety of different places, from, different food outlets or people who worked internally in big businesses. And I showed them just a butchery lesson on how to what we call the haunch of venison, break it down into individual muscles. And so you could braise the shank, and then you've got the other 3 muscles on the side, trim it down and treat it in the same way you could treat the saddle. Last year, I made a pact with the guy who is at Lake District Farmers who sell out deer for us, that we would only sell whole animals. And we did, 1,500 animals, whole. And people had to pay a premium for the expensive bit, and it made them more achievable there. So going forward this year, we like, if it's a special event, we'll break some carcasses if someone needs it. But on a whole, no, we don't do it. And I guess it's just that, saying you don't have a choice. Or you can use whatever the second grade is that you're using somewhere else that's frozen, perhaps. So yeah, it is changing. Chefs need to be told because they don't listen very much. I have a chef the other day, rang a butcher and said, the lambs are getting, they're a bit smaller than they were 3 months ago. It's like, yeah, the season's changed, whatever. The guy said, well, every time I order it, like every 2 or 3 weeks, they just seem to get a little bit bigger. And I'm like, yeah, that's because they're growing. They're not born every Tuesday. And it's hard for chefs to get their head around that because they're demanding, because they think they're demanding for their customers, but actually they just don't have the knowledge that things do go through a growth cycle and you have to wait for things or work seasonally with what's going on. But I think it'll change and get better. There is a movement, but it will take time. But I think suppliers also need to be tougher with chefs as well and tell them, get lost on the phone as much as they're happy to say that to a supplier. So it will come in time, I think.
Actually, it picks up on what you've just mentioned, Brett, but question really for Harry and yourself. Food is a real problem, certainly across the UK, but certainly across the world. Consistency. It's what everybody seems to want, and you mentioned as part of your talk that you were hoping for more fat in the one animal you killed, and it wasn't quite up to spec. So my question really is, are you putting Harry under some sort of pressure to produce consistent food? Or is Harry actually coming back to you and saying, do you know what, there is no such thing as consistency. Everything is genetically diverse, as we all are sat here, different shapes, sizes, and all that sort of thing. Have we got to start embracing the fact that, in actual fact, diversity of supply is something that should be actually celebrated rather than just this continuous production line of everything being exactly the same over and over again?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and one that when I started, I probably was told by lots of farmers that the inconsistency is based on, this, that. And actually, I think there's two issues. One, yes, I hear what you're saying. The other part, I think, comes from some people's farming systems which become lazy and go like, there's an old cold cow over there, seller, whatever, sells into a premium market. It's an 8-year-old heifer that hasn't done very well, whatever, goes into a customer. Then they go, that was a longhorn. I didn't really like that. That wasn't very nice. And then, 6 months later, they got a prime 2.5-year-old heifer that is barren or whatever, and they sell that in different experience. And so I put Harry under lots of pressure. We put each other under lots of pressure because I don't think there's any excuse that we can't weigh the pigs twice a week. We can't work out a graph on how they're going to grow. We can't work out and tell our supplier when it's going to be available. And if the feed conversion rate is this and we want it there, we need to tell them next week that they've got 18 pigs coming that are between 165 and 168. Because we're never going to make a change if we can't compete against those who can do it. And some of those people we're going to be up against in time, they can do it because they do weigh every single thing. They do look at every single parameter to try and get it bang on so that chop fits that supermarket tray. Otherwise, they get downgraded, which I think is an unfair system in some way, but we're not going to take them on if we don't aim to get that consistency. And when Harry explained that system on how we can get there, and we can just apply it to our pigs, they grow the same way as the commercial ones. But we do have to try and hit targets and make sure it's good in all, and see if there's a glut coming. We need to know there's a glut coming so we can do something about it before it lands on our doorstep, and then we make an excuse that pigs are 15 kilos too big. And it's not good for their consistency on their side either. And then the chefs are less likely to order. So we're going to create a problem if we don't get consistency like any business. So I think it's fair to keep putting pressure on Harry.
Okay, question here.
Yeah, thank you very much for the pork. It was good. Harry, I've got a question for you on the pigs. It's a two-part question. Are you in any agri-environment schemes, and is having the outdoor pigs, does that affect any of the agri-environment scheme or cross-compliance?
Good question. So yes, I am in an agri-environmental scheme, but very loosely. So we're an SFI pilot. In terms of countryside stewardship and broader schemes, I'm not in anything. And I suppose in the last 2 or 3 years, I guess with change looming in terms of a different direction of policy, in terms of where that's all going, I've kind of decided to step back from that and luckily leave ourselves flexible to change so that we can pivot and go in a different direction. So as it stands at the moment, the pigs aren't impacting anything that we're doing, and yeah, I need to go in I need to pick one direction or another, and obviously that'll have to dovetail into what we're doing on the pigs.
Did you have a second part? Oh, sorry. Nailed it. I think if I just add on that very quickly, I think knowing the types of options that are becoming available through stewardship, I sort of and the rules that we've had around them so far, which aren't looking like they're going to change drastically. I don't see why the pigs wouldn't fit into that system. I mean, I'm thinking, for example, a herbal ley under stewardship. No reason at all why the pigs couldn't graze that. You've obviously got to leave it alone for 5 weeks at the moment in the late spring, summer, but we could work around that. So I think the two would work together. Yeah, question here.
I've got a very quick question. You said no acorns, is that right? And I'm just I don't quite understand why no acorns. Is it because you don't have any oak trees, or is it because you are anti-acorn?
So it's no, we've got nothing against acorns. No, we don't have actually many acorns or many oak trees. But yeah, when people think Iberian, they think of acorns when you typically think of Spanish produced pigs. And certainly from a nutritional perspective, what we try and do is mimic and look at it in incredible detail. And it's when it actually comes back to Ben's question earlier about control and consistency of the product. But what we do try and do is we match like the tannin profiles and everything within the nutritional specification to kind of mimic them. So no acorns, but I try my best to make them acorns if I can within the feed.
With the acorn thing, they say that the pigs in Spain eat 8 kilos a day of acorns, right? So one of my stupid ideas, which I wasn't really prepared to talk about here, was that those big vacuum cleaners you get for picking up horse manure. We're going to go around the woods because there is lots of woods around Harry's place with lots of acorns and hoover them up before the squirrels get them, and feed them back to the pigs. But I'm not sure yet. But we'll get there.
Why don't you put the pigs in the woods?
They are in any woods that I do have. They are in. It's just we're not blessed with acorn-laden woods on our farm, sadly.
And you would need like hundreds of acres to really get them to the volume you need to make a difference to the meat.
Those farmers who are making changes towards regenerative movements, are you finding that it's impacting on their carcass grades? We can become quite obsessed by R4L with cattle and things like that. So those who are making those management changes, are they still hitting the targets that they need at the butchery end?
Yeah, it's interesting with the grading. Like, so I put some Jersey cows in to Warren's in Launceston, and they get like crap grades because of the conformation and because of the marbling. They actually get scored down. So obviously I take no notice of that, and then that's the most expensive beef you can sell. But it's also a bit inefficient because they're not big, massive carcasses. They're only 240 kilos. So the kill charge is the same. Everything else is the same. And you've got a carcass that's double the size that gets a higher grade. In theory, is a better quality piece of meat than what we produce. So it's the same with the pork. It's not really a grading system except for back fat, I guess. I don't know. I've never really taken any notice of it. But yeah, it is a challenge, I think, that. And that marbled pork would get downgraded, probably. And the back fat's too thick. And so, yeah, I found it with cattle straight away. I was like, tried so hard to get it right, and then I saw the grading. Like, he's like, that's the worst grade you can get. And I was like, he's fed but some of the best beef I've ever seen. So yeah, I guess it's, I guess they're grading for the supermarket, for tray size, for leanness, for what they think the consumer wants. So yeah.
From a commercial perspective of how we used to produce pigs, one of the most infuriating things ever was that obviously, you'd have a contract with a big abattoir, and you would be growing, you'd be graded based on weight and based on back fat. And, if you were 0.1 of a kilo over the top of the weight range, you'd go from having a pig that was worth £150 to being worth £75, which was always incredibly soul destroying because it took the profit of probably another 10, 12, 15 pigs with it. So the nice thing about what we're doing is actually we're coming up with our own standards in terms of how that carcass should be. So we sort of in charge of that a bit from our own back. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Have you looked at other proteins like lupins?
We have looked when we first started on saying we're going to produce all of our own protein. We threw the net out really wide. I suppose coming up with crops that were deemed consistent in yield, and obviously the arable business has still got to stand up on its own 2 feet, and every field that we grow, every crop that we grow on every field, that's all got to stand up financially. So I suppose at the moment peas and beans were probably a go-to just in terms of where we started. I'm certainly not ruling out any other crops, But the thing, as I said earlier, the thing that probably gets me most excited, which is what Ed said, is just the ability to intercrop and grow multiple crops together. And that's a bit of a barrier for some people, because if they grow, beans and oats together, for example, well, they've probably got the cost of splitting them back out again and then selling them to two different people, or, whereas actually the flexibility we have as pig producers is the fact that it can all go into a ration together, and we haven't got that cost. So for us going forward in the future, it will be about expanding, I think, the bicropping and the polycropping within our farming operation, I think.
I think we're good. Time for a beer, boys.
Let's go.